There is a wall in northern England that has stood for nearly 2,000 years. It runs for 117 kilometers across hills, rivers, and moorland, from one coast to the other. Farmers have pulled its stones to build their houses. Sheep graze beside its foundations. And yet, if you stand at its highest point on a cold morning with the wind coming down from the north and the light still pale on the horizon, you can feel something that no history book fully captures. The sense that someone once stood exactly here looking out into the darkness beyond and decided that this was where civilization ended and the unknown began. That someone was a soldier of the 6th Legion VICTRIX, and this is their story. The history of the 6th Legion VICTRIX is, in many ways, the history of Rome's long conversation with its own limits. It is the story of an army that was sent to the edge of the known world and told to hold it, not for a year, not for a decade, but for 3 centuries. It is the story of men who became builders when there was nothing left to conquer, who became guardians when the empire they served began to shrink, and who remained at their post long after the emperors who had sent them there had been forgotten. To understand how they came to stand on that wall in the north of Britain, we must go back to the beginning, to the dying days of the Roman Republic, when legions were not yet the permanent institutions. They would become but instruments of ambition in the hands of powerful men. The 6th Legion traces its origins to around 41 BC, in the final bloody years of the civil wars that followed the assassination of Julius Caesar. It was most likely raised by Octavian, the young man who would one day become the Emperor Augustus, though some ancient sources connect it to the general Mark Antony. The exact circumstances of its founding are lost to time, as they are for so many legions of this era. What we know is that by the time the dust of the civil wars had settled, the 6th existed as a functioning unit with a name, an eagle standard, and a reputation for effectiveness in the field. The title VICTRIX, the victorious, was not given lightly. It was earned. In the early years of Augustus's reign, the legion served in the western provinces, rotating through postings in Spain, Gaul, and along the Rhine frontier. These were years of consolidation rather than conquest. The great wars of expansion were largely over. Rome now needed to digest what it had swallowed, to build roads, garrison towns, collect taxes, and persuade the peoples of the West that Roman order was preferable to the chaos that had preceded it. The soldiers of the 6th became as skilled with a pickaxe as with a gladius. They paved roads, built bridges, and constructed the administrative infrastructure of empire. This was the less celebrated but equally essential face of Roman military power. By the reign of the Emperor Nero, in the middle of the 1st century, the 6th Legion was stationed in Lower Germany at the great fortress city of Novasium on the Rhine. It was here, in the year 68 AD, that the events began to unfold, which would define the Legion's trajectory for the next 3 centuries. The death of Nero, without an heir, triggered the catastrophe that Roman historians would call the Year of the 4 Emperors, 12 months in which the Roman world came apart at its seams as 4 different generals, each commanding the loyalty of different legions, fought for the throne. The 6th VICTRIX, like every other legion on every other frontier, was forced to make a choice. Allegiance was no longer a simple matter of serving Rome. It was a wager on which Rome would survive. The legion initially gave its support to Vitellius, the commander of the Rhine armies, who marched on Rome in the early months of 69 AD and seized power. For a brief period, Vitellius ruled as emperor, but his hold on power was fragile from the beginning. In the east, the legions of Syria and Judea had already declared for a different man, a general of quiet competence and enormous experience named Titus Flavius Vespasian, the same man who had led the Second Augustan Legion in the conquest of Britain a generation earlier. The civil war that followed was short but savage. Vitellius was defeated, and Vespasian became emperor. For the 6th Legion VICTRIX, this change of allegiance was a moment of careful navigation. The legion had backed the losing side. In the brutal mathematics of Roman civil war, this could mean disbandment, disgrace, or worse. But Vespasian was a practical man. He needed experienced troops. He accepted the 6th submission, confirmed their status, and allowed them to continue in service, though the experience left its mark on the collective memory of the unit. The soldiers of the Sixth had learned in the hardest possible way that loyalty was a currency that could be devalued overnight. The great turning point in the history of the Sixth Legion came in 71 AD, when it was transferred to Britain. The island had been under Roman control for nearly 3 decades by this point, but the northern frontier remained unsettled, and the lesson of Boudicca's revolt a decade earlier had not been forgotten. Rome needed a reliable, battle-hardened legion in the north, and the 6th VICTRIX, restored to full strength and newly motivated to prove its worth, was selected for the posting. The legion established its permanent base at a place the Romans called Ibericum. We know it today as York. It was a shrewd choice of location. The city sat at the confluence of 2 rivers, the Ouse and the Fosse, which made it both defensible and accessible by water. It commanded the approaches to the northern uplands, the vast moorland territories where the Brigantes tribe had only recently been pacified, and it was far enough from the more established Roman south to be genuinely useful, a real frontier post rather than a comfortable administrative billet. The fortress that the Sixth built at York was immense. Its walls enclosed 50 acres. Its headquarters building housed the administrative apparatus of the entire northern province. Barracks, granaries, workshops, bathhouses, and temples rose from the ground as thousands of legionaries put their engineering skills to work. Around the fortress, a civilian settlement grew organically. Traders, craftsmen, veterans, and the families of soldiers who were not officially permitted to marry but did so anyway. Within a generation, Ibericum had become one of the most important cities in the province, second only to Londinium itself. The defining moment in the history of the 6th VICTRIX came in 122 AD, when the Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain in person. Hadrian was one of the most intellectually serious of all Rome's emperors, a man who had traveled every corner of the empire, inspected every frontier, and thought deeply about what Roman power could and could not sustain. What he saw in Britain convinced him that the attempt to conquer the entire island was not worth the cost. The Caledonians of the far north, the ancestors of the Scots, had never been subdued. Every campaign that penetrated their territory ended the same way, with the legions advancing, winning every pitched battle, and then watching the enemy melt back into the hills, only to reappear the moment the army marched south. Hadrian's solution was characteristically bold and, in retrospect, historically momentous. He ordered the construction of a wall, not a wooden palisade or an earthen rampart, but a stone wall 8 feet wide and 15 feet high, running from the Solway Firth in the west to the mouth of the Tyne in the east, coast to coast across the narrowest part of the island. It would be garrisoned by thousands of auxiliary troops stationed in forts built at regular intervals along its length. It would have gates to control the movement of people and goods. It would be, in effect, the border of the Roman world. The 6th Legion VICTRIX was one of the primary builders of this wall. For years, centuries of legionaries, each century responsible for its own section, carved their unit inscriptions into the stones as they laid them. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these inscription blocks, and they tell a story of methodical, organized, almost obsessive labor. The soldiers did not build the wall reluctantly. They built it with the same pride that they brought to everything else. Because in the Roman military world, engineering was not a lesser skill than fighting. It was its own form of conquest. The wall changed everything about the 6th Legion's identity. Before Hadrian, the Legion had been a mobile force, capable of long marches, rapid deployments, and offensive operations. After the wall, it became something different. It became a garrison. Its role was no longer to advance, but to hold. This was not a demotion in Roman eyes. The defense of a frontier was as honorable as its conquest, but it required a different set of virtues: patience, endurance, vigilance, and it produced a different kind of soldier. The men who served in the 6th VICTRIX in the 2nd and 3rd centuries were not the freewheeling campaigners of the Civil War era. They were professionals in the truest sense of the word, men who knew every watchtower, every patrol route, every vulnerable point in 100 kilometers of wall. The communities that grew up along the wall reflect this permanence. At York, at Corbridge, at Carlisle, at the wall forts themselves, Roman civilization took deep root. Temples to Jupiter and Mithras stood alongside market squares. Inscriptions record the names of soldiers from every corner of the empire. Men from Syria, from the Rhine Valley, from North Africa, from Spain, who had made this cold northern island their home. Some of them rose to become local magistrates. Some married into the local British aristocracy. Some died at their posts and were buried in cemeteries beside the road, their tombstones bearing brief, dignified inscriptions that have survived 2,000 years of wind and rain. The 3rd century brought a new kind of pressure to the northern frontier. The relative stability of the Antonine era gave way to a period of almost continuous crisis, internal political instability, external invasion, financial collapse, and epidemic disease. The empire that the 6th Legion had been built to defend was becoming, in certain lights, almost unrecognizable. The crisis reached Britain directly in 193 AD, when the governor of the province, Clodius Albinus, declared himself emperor and transported a substantial portion of the British garrison, including detachments from the 6th VICTRIX, across the Channel to press his claim in Gaul. He was defeated and killed by Septimius Severus in 197 AD. The legions that had backed him returned to Britain under a cloud, and the northern frontier, stripped of troops for the Gallic adventure, had suffered accordingly. Barbarian incursions had reached deep into the province. Forts had been burned. Civilians had fled. Septimius Severus, now the undisputed master of Rome, recognized that Britain required his personal attention. In 208 AD, already in his 60s and in failing health, he crossed to the island with the largest army seen in Britain since the days of Agricola. His stated intention was to complete what Agricola had begun, to conquer the entire island. The 6th VICTRIX, reinforced and re-equipped, formed the core of this force. They marched north with the emperor at their head, campaigning deep into Caledonian territory for 2 full seasons. The campaigns were inconclusive. The Caledonians refused to stand and fight in the open, resorting instead to the guerrilla tactics that had defeated every Roman general who had ventured north of the wall. Disease and exhaustion took a steady toll on the Roman column, and in 211 AD, at York, Septimius Severus died. He had not conquered Caledonia. He had not even come close. But his presence had accomplished something important. It had reminded the northern tribes that Rome, even an aging and troubled Rome, still had the will and the resources to project overwhelming force. For a generation after his death, the frontier was quiet. The deeper transformation came gradually, across the troubled decades of the 3rd century. The old system of permanent single legion garrisons gave way to something more fluid and more desperate. When a crisis broke out on one frontier, troops were pulled from another. The 6th VICTRIX sent detachments to the Rhineland, to Gaul, to the Danube. What remained at York was often a skeleton force, enough to maintain the fiction of a full legion, but no longer the formidable instrument it had once been. The wall itself was still garrisoned, still maintained, still functioning, but the world it had been built to defend was changing in ways that no wall could stop. The late 3rd and early 4th centuries brought one final, extraordinary moment to the story of the 6th Legion and the city of York. In 306 AD, the Emperor Constantius I was campaigning in the north of Britain when he fell gravely ill. He withdrew to York, the traditional base of Roman power in the province, and there, in the great fortress that the 6th had built 2 centuries before, he died. His son was at his bedside. The legions and the cavalry units present, including whatever remained of the 6th VICTRIX, gathered in the fortress courtyard and proclaimed the young man emperor. His name was Constantine. History would later call him Constantine the Great. It was one of the most consequential moments in the history of the world, and it happened in a Roman fortress in the north of England because a tired emperor had come home to his garrison city to die. The 6th Legion, VICTRIX, did not make Constantine emperor in any strategic or political sense. They were simply the soldiers who happened to be present. But their presence in that fortress, in that city, was itself the product of 3 centuries of Roman persistence at the edge of the world. The final chapter of the 6th Legion's history is written not in battles, but in silences. As the 4th century progressed, the structure of the Roman military continued to evolve, away from the old legionary model and towards smaller, more mobile units capable of responding to threats that could emerge anywhere along thousands of kilometers of frontier. The Sixth VICTRIX shrank, reorganized, and adapted, as all the old legions did. It appears in administrative records of the late Empire, still listed, still nominally present. But the great fortress at York was no longer the bustling military city it had been in Hadrian's time. The final withdrawal of Roman troops from Britain came in stages across the late 4th and early 5th centuries, driven not by defeat, but by the escalating demands of a shrinking empire. Magnus Maximus stripped the island of troops in 383 AD to support his claim to the Western throne. Constantine III did the same in 47 AD. By 410 AD, when the Emperor Honorius supposedly wrote to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defense, the organized Roman military presence on the island had effectively ended. What became of the remaining soldiers of the Sixth VICTRIX is unknown. Some may have integrated into local power structures, becoming the military backbone of the sub-Roman kingdoms that replaced Roman administration. Some may have crossed to Gaul in one of the final troop movements. Some simply stayed, living out their days in the houses their fathers had built in the shadow of the fortress walls. The wall still stands, not complete, not as Hadrian built it. Centuries of stone robbers have reduced much of it to its foundations, but along its highest sections, where the stone proved too difficult to carry away, it remains, gray and enduring against the northern sky. Each year, thousands of people walk its length, looking out across the same moorland that the sentinels of the Sixth VICTRIX once scanned for movement in the darkness. They are looking for something, for a connection to a world that was in many ways utterly unlike their own, and in some ways, remarkably similar. People doing a difficult job far from home, in a landscape that was sometimes beautiful and often hostile, trying to hold something together that they knew in their quieter moments could not be held forever. The Sixth Legion, VICTRIX, was not the most celebrated of Rome's legions. It did not fight at Cannae or Zama. It did not march with Caesar into Gaul or with Trajan into Dacia. Its greatest campaigns were in defense rather than conquest, in construction rather than destruction. But it was present at moments that shaped the world we live in. The consolidation of Roman Britain, the building of Hadrian's Wall, the proclamation of Constantine the Great. For 3 centuries, it stood at the edge of the empire and kept watch. That is, in the end, no small thing. If this story of one of Rome's most enduring legions stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And on the side of this video, I've left a suggestion for another story from the ancient world, one that I think will fit perfectly with what you have just heard.